Howdy, folks, and welcome back to the End Times. We're going to jump back into the Revelation to John. In today's volume, Volume 8, we'll continue John's strange vision. I think it's very healthy to take a break every week from all the problems that we have, all the stuff in the news, all the politics, the money concerns. I think it's helpful to just kick back, relax, and talk about problems that are even worse. You know, if you're frustrated with the way today went, let's think about the last day. Let's think about the end of the world and all the suffering and the horror and the confusion that is pretty much guaranteed to occur in that kind of situation. And according to this book, occur very soon. Now, in previous chapters, we've been talking a lot about bugs and scorpion torture monsters and people in lots of pain. But then also other people escaping into the world of Porneia. But in this volume, things finally start to get a little strange. Up until now, John is just an ordinary guy having an ordinary day. And we're just sort of waiting for something odd to happen. Or waiting for him to say something bizarre or shocking. And he hasn't yet. It's been pretty dull. But in this volume, we finally get some confusing imagery. More confusing than horrific in this volume. The next few chapters are mostly just creepy and confusing. And here's the thing. There's no real go-to, solid, recognized interpretation for any of this stuff. There are questions all around. Whether you're coming from an Orthodox Christian perspective, at this point in the book you might be starting to wonder about John's theology. And if you're coming from a historical perspective, you might become a little dazzled by how readily and how easily John equates Rome with Satan. In the next two chapters that we'll cover in volumes 8, 9, and 10, we will see that this is the last Jedi phase of the book of Revelation. It's the one that subverts our expectations. These are the books that divide the audience. And Revelation is a very divisive text. That's why I like it. It's creepy. It's unsettling. It's complicated. It's written in a dead language. I mean, what's not to love? And even better, it's written in a dead language in a confusing stream of consciousness style. And it's clearly written by a man who has deep political and religious biases that he seems to be applying to a genuine, extreme mental experience that he had on this island. The Isle of Patmos. Apologies to John for mentioning the name of the island. He made it clear that he didn't like the place, and he didn't want to be there. And I think at this point, we're all starting to get the clear indication that this material was written by a man who was suffering and was alone. There's a very large and perhaps unhealthy dose of despair and anger in the material. So what's not to love? And I'm excited to find out what's going to happen when the 7th trumpet blows. I know we've all been waiting for weeks now. Surely it's going to be really great and conclusive and clear, and we're all going to understand it. There's zero chance it'll be strange or anticlimactic, right? Not the book of Revelation. Well, I'm ready. Let's hear that 7th trumpet.
Then I saw another powerful angel coming down from heaven. He was dressed in a cloud, and there was a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs were pillars of fire. He held a small scroll in his hand, and it was opened. He stood with his right foot in the sea, and his left foot on the land. And he shouted so loudly, it was like a lion roaring. And when he shouted, the 7 peals of thunder spoke with their own voices. And when they spoke, I was about to begin writing. But a voice from heaven said, "Seal up the things spoken by the thunder, and do not write them down." And the angel that I had seen standing on the sea and on the land raised his right hand to the heavens, and he swore to him who lives forever and ever, to him who created the heavens and the things in it, and the earth and the things in it, and the sea and the things in it.
The time of waiting is no more. In the days of the sound of the 7th angel, when he is about to blow his trumpet, the mystery of God will be fulfilled, just as he declared to his servants, the prophets.
Well, that was odd. And let's go ahead and get some of the Greek out of the way real quick before we start to talk about what the heck does that mean. This being is apparently wearing a cloud the way somebody might wear a robe. So they are wrapped in a cloud, or swaddled in clouds. Peribeblemenon. Beblemenon, and that just means wearing it the way you'd wear an item of clothing, and that peri at the beginning underlines the fact that this is a kind of wrapping, that they're enclosed in it. And nepelen is cloud, a cloud. Next, we are told that this angel is holding a biblaridion. That bibla might sound familiar. That is the Greek word for a book or scroll. This word right here, biblaridion, is a diminutive form, which underlines the fact that it's sort of a little scroll. I think of something more like maybe a receipt from Target or somewhere, rather than a giant scroll that is a foot or two wide that you have to unroll at arm's length in front of your face. This seems to be something you can hold easily, say between 2 fingers. So maybe not a CVS receipt. Maybe more like Michael's, something more reasonable. Michael's or Hobby Lobby. And so we have the angel showing up, strangely dressed. There's this little scroll. We are also almost overhearing what voices of thunder are saying. Chai chepta brontai, the 7 thunders, the 7 peals of thunder. And John was ordered to sfragison, seal it up, ha elalesan, which is the stuff they said. So, seal up the stuff the 7 thunders said, or keep under seal, maintain it as an official secret, what you heard from the 7 peals of thunder. And this sfragison might sound familiar. It's a verbal form of the same hard-to-pronounce word for a seal, sealed using a signet device. And so this is clearly a metaphorical statement. John is required to not write down, to refrain from writing down some of the things he heard here. And they say, Me alta grapes. Now, alta. If that sounds like auto, like automatic, there's a good reason for that, because altos or alto are some of the forms of the ancient Greek word for that or it. It just refers to a thing. So alta here just means that stuff. Grapes is a form of grapein, Graphein. Now that Graph should probably ring a few bells. And that is the ancient Greek word for writing or drawing. They didn't quite make that distinction, so me alta grapes means don't write this stuff down. So this implies that John understood what the 7 thunders were saying, and it implies that he knows something that the audience doesn't at this point. What is this thing that he knows that we don't? This passage mentions the mystery of God. We'll talk about what that word mystery really means, and that is something that's going to be fulfilled when the 7th angel finally does blow his trumpet. But until then, it's not something that John will see fulfilled or have access to. Unfortunately, a lot of the intellectual and political tradition of our entire civilization, in several cases, hinges on ancient Greek's cute little way of using its dense grammar to have these very dense set phrases that don't sound like much, but they have a huge amount of meaning. What do I mean by that? Well, in the last passage, we heard about him who created the heavens and the things in it, and the earth and the things in it, and the sea and the things in it. I'm sure that got a little flat or repetitive at a certain point. I think this is a good example of what Monty Python was making fun of in The Quest for the Holy Grail, when the monk named Brother Maynard took out the Book of Armaments and began reading the instructions for how to use the holy hand grenade of Antioch. And there was a lot of formulaic language, and especially repetitive language.
First, shalt thou take out the holy pin. Then shalt thou count to 3. No more, no less. 3 shall be the number thou shalt count. And the number of the counting shall be 3. 4 shalt thou not count, neither count thou 2, excepting that thou then proceed to 3. 5 is right out. Once the number 3, being the third number, be reached, then lobbest thou thy holy hand grenade of Antioch towards thy foe, who, being naughty in my sight, shall snuff it.
And a lot of this has to do with how Greek uses its dense grammar to be clever and very clear. And it's something that we don't really do in English. And especially your older, learned, authoritative writers in the ancient world, they were very fond of this kind of what we'll call hyper-clarity. So what I'm getting at is that it's tempting to add these kinds of things in Greek because it's so easy to say.
We're going down to ancient Greek grammar junction, where every word has a specific function. It ain't fun, it ain't sexy, it's not even all that interesting. But for some reason, Vincent is obsessed. So let's hear him out.
So, and the stuff in it, you can just say kai ta in alte. Kai means and. Ta is really just a Greek word for thee, but it's the plural neuter version of their indefinite article, which they use as a catch-all to just refer to stuff. And we know here he's talking about stuff, which might be something physical, like a bag of coins or widgets, but it also indicates that we're not talking about people. Now, ta in alte, that's another version of alta, and here it just means in it, the thing we were talking about. So kai ta in alte means, and all the stuff that's in the thing we just talked about. Now, this neat little catch-all trick is something that many Indo-European languages can do. It's not unique to Greek. But ancient Greek has a wildly disproportionate impact on the entirety of Western civilization, precisely because of the tremendous impact that writers like Aristotle and Plato had on the rest of history. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's look at one of our sciences, often called the queen of the sciences, because it's among the most reliable. Physics. Now, we can all tell by now that since the word physics starts with PHY, that we're probably looking at an English word that came from ancient Greek, and you'd be right. But ancient Greek also gives us a hint as to why is it plural. In some languages, they dropped the S, and it's just physique. It's not physics. But we kept the S in English. We kept it plural. Physics. All of this comes from how Aristotle classified material in his lectures. And his lecture notes were passed down to his nephew, Nicomachos, who edited them and had them copied and published. And thanks to him, we have a lot of copies of even some of Aristotle's driest and least compelling work. And speaking of dry and uncompelling, politics comes from ancient Greek. And it's plural for the same reason that economics is, because it comes from ancient Greek, and physics is because it comes from ancient Greek. And it has to do with that neuter plural ta, that article trick that they used. So let's say that we want to describe an animal. And in Greek, an animal is zdoion. Now let's say that this animal is clearly designed to live in a community with a large number of other animals of its kind. And these large communities are called poleis. We borrowed the English word polis from it, P-O-L-I-S, which became the basis of words like metropolis or the word police in general. So you would say that this zdoion was politikon. It is a zdoion politikon, a phrase that Aristotle wrote that was later mistranslated, really, as political animal. You may have heard that Aristotle wrote at some point that man is a political animal. Well, no, not really. He was classifying humans as a kind of creature that is necessarily social, meaning humans cannot live well by themselves. He put us in the same category as bees. If you find a worker bee and you isolate that bee from its community, it's just going to eventually die. And Aristotle said that humans can survive on their own, of course, with enough skill, but they can't thrive on their own. One human always needs other humans to reach their full potential. Now, if you wanted to write a book about all things political, the cool thing is that in Greek, you could just title your book Ta Politika. Ta Politika. Stuff about politics. Political stuff. The Greek word physis, P-H-Y-S-I-S, refers to the natural order of things, the rules, how objects behave, how animals behave, which is a little different than how we use it. We tend to think of the physics, the physis, of an asteroid going around the sun, and we expect to be able to do calculations to figure out where it's going to go next. But Aristotle would have said that you and I also have physeis. We also have our natures, and a philosopher or scientist who knew enough could make some predictions about our behavior also. Now, Aristotle's nephew collected all of his uncle's lectures on the nature of the physical world, and he put that in a section that he called Ta Huzika, the stuff about the natural world, the stuff about the material order of things. And of course, that later was translated into physics. Well, now, Aristotle was not just interested in the bare bones material function of the universe. He was also interested in what's behind the universe. What comes after physics, when all is said and done. And so this is where Aristotle talked about things like morality or God and the ultimate purpose of human life or the universe itself. Now, since these lectures were placed in the book after the material related to physics, in ancient Greek, the word for after or behind is meta. So, ta metahuzika would be all the stuff that comes after physics, all the stuff that's behind physics. And that's where we get the fancy term metaphysics. So if you've ever heard someone use the term metaphysical or describe themselves as a metaphysician, just know that it's just an old fancy word for philosopher or maybe even mystic. So now we know why a lot of our sciences end in a plural. It's because of the roundabout grammar tricks that Greek writers used. And they get frozen and imported into English. And this is the kind of thing that just makes undergraduates wrinkle their eyebrows and sigh and memorize the next pointless thing to move on. Because we got saddled with a pretty broad variety of thinkers in Western civilization, and they definitely brought their own cultural and linguistic habits to bear. It's part of why the Western tradition is so rich, but also complicated. And speaking of complicated, let's turn our attention back to John the Elder, our author here. Unfortunately, we are going to come right back to Aristotle shortly, so apologies in advance. Now, we do need to turn back to John to talk about this mystery of God that John says will be finished or completed or brought to fruition. He says, Kai eteleste tot mysterion tu teu hos evangelisen. Now, you may have recognized the word theu, which would be of God, tu teu. Then hos is as, evangelisen is a Greek verb that just means as it was evangelized. In other words, as it was distributed as good news. To evangelize is an actual full-on verb in Greek, and it really means to bring good news to get people up to speed on the good announcement that was made. That's what evangelism really means. And so, just as it was told to people, this mystery of God will be eteleste. That is a Greek word that means finished or completed or brought to fruition. Now, that causes a little bit of an issue for me because mysteries aren't usually completed or finished. They're normally solved. They're made to go away. They are replaced with knowledge. And I wanted to point out that although we get our word mystery from ancient Greek, the weird use of Y at the beginning is a good clue. But I wanted to say that what happened was, in modern thought, there became this division between problems and mysteries. And problems were practical situations that we had to deal with, and we figured out the facts, and we developed some sort of process for dealing with that problem. Mysteries are a little different. They're considered maybe less immediately necessary in terms of what you need to study or work on. And a lot of times, mysteries are these subjects that humans have sort of given up on, that we have left alone for mystics or ancient writers or podcasters to rant about in the middle of the night. And that's not really the sense of the ancient Greek word. It really just means a secret. It's a word that refers to complex information that has to be revealed to somebody. In other words, it's not information you can figure out yourself. We also have to bear in mind that in the non-Christian world that John is familiar with, there are thousands of what were called mystery cults. And basically, these were rites that you could be initiated into where you were given secret information about a particular god that only adherents to a particular cult knew about. These divine secrets that are handed out only to certain people is something that's extremely prevalent in the non-Christian world. And so when we think of the Greek word mystery in this way, it makes a lot more sense when we pair it with a word like fulfilled, since what John is really saying here is not that in the very end we're finally going to find out what this God guy is all about. He said that God has been declaring certain things to us all along. And this verb eteleste is really telling us that God's purposes will be brought to a conclusion, that God's plan will reach an end. It's an ending. It's the reaching of a purpose or a goal. And unfortunately, this brings us back to Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a lot about the purpose or the goals or the end of something. And since he wrote in ancient Greek, albeit 400 years before John the Elder, Aristotle used a word that is basically a noun companion to the verb eteleste that we just saw here. And it's the Greek word telos. Telos. You would transliterate that T-E-L-O-S. And it just means the end, as in the purpose or goal of something. So, what's the purpose of life? That's something humans ask all the time. What is my telos? What is the telos of the earth? In other words, why did it form in the first place? What's it supposed to be? How long is it going to be here? These are the concerns of what came to be known in philosophy as teleology. And now that we know these ancient Greek words, we know that teleology is the branch of philosophy that focuses on studying the purpose or goal of things that are observed in the universe. And Aristotle, of course, focused mostly on us and plants and other animals and the universe in general. And so John the Elder is not saying that in the very end we're going to find out this new information about God. What he's saying is we're finally going to see what the purpose of all this was to begin with. That we're going to see the telos of the universe. We're going to see the very end purpose, the highest goal that God was aiming for. Unfortunately, John is telling us to get to that point, a lot of terrible things have to happen first. But in the very end, all of this has to happen so that whatever God's goals were when it comes to humans and Earth, they would be fulfilled by all these things happening. That they would be brought to a conclusion because of the terrible things that are happening. And once again, I have to bring us back to the word dei, transliterated D-E-I, which is basically a Greek word for must. It's moral necessity that this occurs. Okay, so we're not going to get a seventh trumpet, but what's going to happen next? This next passage closes out chapter 10 of the Revelation to John. And chapter 11 is when we meet the beast, and when we get to hear about the number that's connected to him. So, this closing out of chapter 10 probably is going to be memorable. Something has to happen. And I'm sure whatever happens next is going to be normal and not strange or confusing or upsetting at all. I mean, why would it be? So let's see what happens next to close out chapter 10.
And the voice that I heard coming from the heavens was speaking to me again. It said, "Go and take the open scroll from the hand of the angel standing on the sea and on the land." I went to the angel, saying to him,
Can I
"Give me the little scroll."
have that little scroll, please?
And the angel said to me,
Take it,
Thank you.
take it, and eat it. It will make you nauseated, but to your mouth, it will be as sweet as honey.
And I took the little scroll from the angel's hand and I ate it. And in my mouth, it was sweet like honey, but my stomach became bitter. And they said to me, "You must again prophesy to many races and nations and languages and kings."
Well, that was unexpected. I wasn't prepared for him to eat the scroll, but John's a real one. He, DGAF, he goes for it. So, respect to him. I don't know how effective I would have been in that situation. I don't know if I would have done that. But, we don't know what kind of direct control over his mind these beings may be exerting. So he eats the scroll, and that definitely is another example of the subverted expectations that I was talking about earlier. And so we have another The Last Jedi situation where John is just keeping us on our toes in terms of storytelling expectations. Now, what does it mean? I think most scholars and analysts have been forced to accept that this is probably just a symbolic statement. As in, you may think it's pleasant to know the mind of God. That may be an idea that is sweet to the taste, but you may regret having that knowledge. God's plans are not necessarily for humans to understand or to deal with. So I think it might be referring to a contradiction there where humans find consolation in seeking God and studying the experiences of people like John. But there's a price to pay. I guess it's like that old idea that if you stare into the abyss stares back at you. John is certainly having to endure his share of bitterness in his life because of his beliefs and the testimony that he has upheld, as he would say. I want to mention now that in the very next passage, the angel goes on to give John a job, a task, after telling him that he was going to have to do a lot more prophesying to a lot more people. I wanted to get that out of the way to make sure people understood that John doesn't fall asleep after eating the scroll. He doesn't suddenly wake up the next morning with a bad headache and a hankering to go get some letter writing done. So, John eating the scroll doesn't seem to have some sort of physical effect in the story or in his vision. Now, of course, I got to mention a couple of Greek words here. The Greek word for sweet should be very familiar. Glyky. And it would be transliterated Glyky. 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 And we hear echoes of the ancient Greek word glyky in English words like glucose, or this new medical term I hear, glycemic index, GLYCEMIC. So as you can see, words that relate to sweetness or sugar or carbohydrates that start with GLU or GLY come from glyky. That's not a very pleasant word, but it does represent something very pleasant in Greek. It's not the word for sugar, because they didn't have refined sugar in antiquity. So it really just meant the taste of something that's sweet. And believe me, the standards for what qualified as sweet were pretty low in antiquity. Food in general must have tasted pretty bad. We know that refined sugar was nowhere to be found. Definitely no high fructose corn syrup. And even the fruit back then, we would have found to be very sour and not very sweet. Because apples, oranges, cherries, all that stuff has for the last 100 or so years been bred to be sweeter and sweeter and sweeter every year. And so if you gave an ancient person one of the leading brands of apples now, like a Honeycrisp apple or a Fuji or something like that, they wouldn't recognize it as what they would call an apple, which were little greenish yellow, hard, sour objects. These big red things are kind of a product of the 19th century American experience. And so the angel says that the scroll would be Gluku Hos Meli. Now, Hos, you may remember, is as, or just like. So the thing is going to be sweet like Meli, which would be transliterated M-E-L-I. And that is the Greek word for honey, which they did have, and they had a lot of it, and it was economically incredibly important. And some of you may know that meli is honey, and meli is made by melitai. Melitai are honeybees in Attic Greek, and in later forms of Greek, melita came to be pronounced melissa. So, if you know anyone named Melissa, it's an old Greek name for honeybee. And some of you may recall that John I don't want to say his name. I don't want to summon him accidentally like I did in a previous volume. So I'll say John, the one who yells in the hallway. John, the one who liked to dunk people in water for ceremonial spiritual reasons. We'll put it that way. That particular John was known for eating meliagrion, which is honey of the field, or wild honey. In other words, honey that he took from wild honeybees. He wasn't doing any beekeeping out there in the wilderness, in other words. And so, as you can see, that's an example of someone in the Bible eating something they wouldn't normally eat. And just like John the Elder on Patmos, eating this little scroll in his vision, I looked around for other instances of people in antiquity, in the Bible, in Greco-Roman culture, eating things that they wouldn't normally eat. Situations where they were forced to eat something that would be normally inedible, but they do it anyway. Now, it turns out the pickings are kind of slim. Believe me, I wish I could find some sort of treasure trove of stories of encounters with NHI in the ancient world where the NHI gave them strange things to eat and it made them feel nauseous, but blah, blah, blah. No, that didn't happen. I don't find any of that. It's pretty bare bones. Everything I found, which I will discuss, but just know, it's a bit of a reach. John the Elder is just going to have to stand alone as a weirdo who likes to eat scrolls. I can't find any companions for him in that area. Unless you stretch the context from eating things that are normally inedible to just eating things you're not supposed to eat. How about that? If you give me that much room, then I can find some good stories for you. You find that in Homer. You find it in Celtic myths. We'll talk about fairy food shortly. But the one big story that I could find that seemed to have multiple connections with what just happened between John the Elder and this angel has to do with the story of Persephone. Now, Persephone was a deity. She was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, otherwise known as Demeter or Demeter. The original pronunciation was something like Demeter, if you're going with the Attic pronunciation. We'll talk about the Doric pronunciation shortly, which is going to be revealing. Now, the name Persephone is interesting because it sounds pretty Greek at first. At first, it seems like it's a female name for someone who sounds like a Persian, or someone whose voice is somehow Asiatic or reminds someone of a Persian. But it appears that that's not where the name comes from. And one clue there is that the name in Greek is not pronounced Persephone, which would be Persian voice, but Persephone. And in many communities, we find the name being written Persepata, and in other variations. And so, historians, looking at all the variants of her name and how it doesn't seem to correspond with actual Greek elements, given all of that information, historians have begun to think that Persephone was a local deity, a goddess of agriculture, that was worshipped by the indigenous people who lived in what's now Greece before they were invaded by the horse-riding Caucasians from farther north in the Balkans, who brought the actual Greek language with them. And so what we're seeing here is a little bit of a collision between two cultures. And remember from the episode on the mutants from the Caucasus, we talked about how the indigenous people of Europe that were invaded by the Indo-Europeans were small, scattered farming communities. So that's why the gods that the Caucasians brought with them were gods of thunder and the sky and things like that, where the local deities that represented the local springs or snakes or barley, those were not brought by the Caucasians. So Persephone was the daughter of the chief deity and Demeter, which in Attic Greek would be pronounced Gemeter, kind of like Gemeter. Now, that GE might ring a bell. Ge, or Gaia, is earth in Greek. So, in Doric Greek, Demeter was Damater. So, long story short, Demeter means Earth Mother, Mother Earth. She was the goddess of the earth that the agricultural people worshipped before the blue-eyed Caucasians showed up and changed their political system and forced them to also worship their gods of thunder and lightning and the sky and all that stuff. The gods they brought with them. In fact, it's interesting because you can almost see the symbolism here. The chief deity brought by the horse-bound invaders, Zeus, is, of course, immediately paired up with the Earth Mother, the deity that represented the land under the feet of the people who were just conquered. And so here's Persephone, Persepata, this little girl who is the product of the union between these two. Persephone's iconography involves ears of grain, or sheaves of barley or wheat. And there's some indication that her name in the indigenous language refers to that particular part of the plant. So she's very much a symbol, an agricultural goddess. And of course, lust rears its ugly head because Zeus's brother Hades takes a liking to Persephone and actually has her abducted and brought down to the underworld to be with him. And yes, I got a little excited when I saw the word abducted. Here's a being that I found in my search for stories of people eating things they weren't supposed to eat. And I ended up with this old story. But it has the word abduction in it. Now, there's no indication that Persephone was taken from her home in the middle of the night by 4.5-foot tall beings with no hair and large black eyes. I couldn't find that story. Wish I could, but no, it just appears that agents of Hades bring Persephone down to the underworld. And, of course, as the story unfolds, Hades is aware that he can't keep Persephone prisoner in the underworld forever. But he works out a little trick. For very, very old reasons, for reasons related to social taboos that date back to the Ice Age, Hades has the idea that if he can get Persephone to eat a pomegranate, she'll be stuck in the underworld forever. So Hades apparently falls in love with her. He wants to keep her in the underworld. And so by Persephone eating part of the pomegranate, she is bound to the underworld for part of the year. Now, clearly this seems to be an old myth that explains the seasons. In other words, why does winter have to happen? Well, this story explained to the early Greeks that winter has to happen because death has a strange love or fascination or interest in the fruit that the earth produces. Hades wants part of that beauty for himself. All of the beautiful flowering of the earth, Hades misses out on. He wants some of that down there with him. And so unfortunately, because death is one of the most powerful beings in the universe, we have to share the earth and its bounty with death. Death always gets his cut. You can't lock him out of the deal. And we know that the ancient Greeks took this story seriously, and they saw this symbolic connection between life and death in the story, because Persephone's story plays a role in what was called the Eleusinian Mysteries. There was a city called Eleusis, Eleusis, and there was a mystery cult that developed there and spread from that area. And just like I had mentioned earlier, these mystery cults were religious rites that people could choose to undertake, and they were given various types of cultural or political value. In other words, if you've undergone or undertaken the Eleusinian Mysteries, that means you participated in certain secret rituals and were given certain secret information that you were supposed to take to the grave, only discuss with other initiates, and it gave you an advantage in life and in the afterlife. The Eleusinian Mysteries were about the afterlife in particular. They were about negotiations with Hades. And they were extremely popular and widespread. I always found it fascinating that people like Socrates was well known for having undergone the Eleusinian mystery rites. Whatever secrets about the underworld were revealed in those rites, Socrates was there as a young man and participated in that. And I think that's fascinating because, of course, Socrates goes on later in life to be convicted and executed for his impiety. In other words, denying the existence of certain gods. Socrates had this crazy idea that what if there were far fewer gods than we thought? What if the divine forces in the universe were a lot more rigid and aligned and not nearly as chaotic or conflicting as people tended to think? Now, for someone who went on to be executed for suggesting that maybe a natural cycle of heating and cooling was responsible for rain and thunder and lightning, and maybe not just Zeus getting bored, for someone who was eventually forced to drink hemlock tea and die from suffocation laying on a stone slab in Athens one night, waiting for his diaphragm to stop moving. Of course, we'll have to do an entire episode about the trial and death of Socrates. That's some pretty intense stuff. And also controversial. Most of what we know about Socrates, we know from Plato. And unfortunately, the other part that we know about Socrates comes from pretty hostile people. So we really have to triangulate to try to figure out who Socrates really was, because one thing is for sure, he was an extremely divisive figure. You either loved him or hated him. But in any case, even someone as out of the loop and unusual and iconoclastic as Socrates also participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, as did Themistocles and all these other leaders of Athens that were champions of reason and institutions and organization and logic. But yet, they still had strong feelings and reserved a definite place in their life for the irrational secrets of the underworld. Secrets that might help bring about a better afterlife. Because remember, in the pre-Christian world, there's no telling where you ended up after death. And people were not sorted into good and bad. The idea that there was a good place to go after you die and a bad place that you go after you die is generally credited with the Persians, a development that occurred in the areas ruled by Persia in the Eastern Mediterranean and, of course, what's now Iran, from, say, the Bronze Age collapse all the way down through the Roman period. Now, we've talked about Persians and Romans, and we've been all over the Mediterranean. But one thing I do also need to mention is that once you go farther up into the scary, cold, wild lands of Northern Europe, you do run into stories about fairies. And fairy stories sometimes include rules and incidents that relate to what's called fairy food. What the heck is fairy food? Well, once again, we're running into a problem of having very, very thin original sources. Essentially, what we know about fairy food is handed down in folk tales that were not written down till, some of them, the 17th or 18th centuries AD. The way it works is that if you find yourself in fairyland, if you find yourself in Magonia, so if you ever find yourself in a world populated by little magical people who trick you or try to give you information about the future or steal your children, which happens a lot in those Celtic stories, don't eat the food. If you eat the food, you might be trapped there forever. It's a hospitality rule.
Eat it! Eat it! Eat the food! Eat all the food!
Don't eat anything that you're offered when you're in fairyland, or you may never come home. Now, part of my brain can't help but try to connect all of this back to what we just heard from John, eating the scroll. But I gotta say, when you think about it logically, I think we're jumping too many traditions. The scroll is not food. Fairy food is usually actual food. Usually something enticing. It's not a piece of parchment or vellum. And so I came all this way to say, I think John's alone here. I think this is something that just happened in John's vision. And it means what it means for him. I don't think we can bring these other traditions into bear. Especially not stories about fairy food. And John, I am almost certain, has no knowledge of the Eleusinian mysteries. John, the elder, our author, I assure you, was not inducted into the Eleusinian mysteries and would have gladly died rather than participate in such a thing. So he does not have that information. And this story is not any sort of indication of connection between John and any non-Christian practices like this. I'm just desperately looking around John's world, looking for where this may have come from. And I'm just saying, I didn't find anything. In fact, the closest thing I can find is also in the Bible. When you look in the Bible for stories of people eating things, or talking about consuming something that they may not otherwise want to consume, we're of course brought back to the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, I think most of us have heard the story of the Garden of Eden, but just to recap, first there was nothing, and then God made everything. It does say in Genesis that God made humans, male and female, and put them on the world to populate it. Then it goes on to talk about Eden and Adam being by himself. Now, this is common. In the Old Testament, if you go back and look at some of these stories, you'll find that what you have is a kind of pastiche of different versions of the same old story that have been stitched together by an editor sometime between, say, 700 BC and 300 BC. It turns out we did have a source that talked about God creating humans, both male and female, in what appears to be a simultaneous fashion. Then we have this other story that focuses on Adam when he was by himself. And this causes some confusion or complications later when people point out, well, hey, so were all of Adam and Eve's grandchildren the products of incest? Well, that may not be the case. And one thing we can say about the story of Adam and Eve is that there are some indications that it is intended to be allegorical. That what the Garden of Eden story is about is explaining why it is that people suffer. Explaining why this whole humans living on Earth thing didn't quite go the way God planned it. And it all has to do with this darn tree. So in John's vision, he is being compelled to eat a piece of parchment or vellum. But in the Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve could eat whatever they wanted with one exception. And this is usually called forbidden fruit. But we have to remember that the tree has a long and complex name in the story. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of knowledge. It's not a tree of evil or good. There's not like fruit on it that's evil or fruit on it that's good, and that's why the tree is dangerous. No, it's when you eat from this tree, it gives you a perception. It gives you an ability you didn't have before. Now, the Latin Vulgate translated the Hebrew into lignum scientiae boni et mali. So lignum would be the tree, scientiae, of knowledge, the root of our word science, and then, well, knowledge of what? Boni, of good, et, and mali, of evil. Boni et mali. And so a lot of scholars and a lot of people like me see this as an allegory about the burden of moral responsibility. The tree represents reaching a level of free will and self-awareness. It represented the point at which Adam and Eve achieved a level of free will and self-awareness at which God was forced to hold them accountable for the actions that they took. It's clear that God originally did not see Adam and Eve that way. It appears that he didn't want to see them that way. He didn't want them to see themselves that way. There was a level of responsibility that God was willing to forego in humans. He was going to give us a pass because we were innocent. Sort of like when, in my past, some of the various cats that I've lived with, they've done some pretty crummy things, but you have to look at the universe from their point of view. they're not the same intensely social creatures that we are. And so ideas about reciprocity, deception, don't exactly resonate with them in the same way. And so you can't hold a grudge against a cat for moral reasons, for their moral failures, in the same way that you can judge a human. And I think the wearing of clothing is a really good symbol of that. Remember, before Adam and Eve ate the fruit, they didn't wear clothing, and they didn't feel that they needed to. But once they ate the fruit, then all of a sudden they realized, holy shit, we're naked. What's going on? Put some clothes on, woman. And so what had happened was Eve was talking to the serpent. And what I find really interesting is that the serpent really just tells Eve the truth. The serpent technically doesn't lie to Eve. The serpent says God knows that the day that you eat that fruit, you won't die on that day, but your eyes will be opened and you'll become more like God. So Eve was thinking, I won't die, which is true. She did not die. And I'll become more like God, which is true. She did. And if you read the story, God says after the fruit has been eaten that they've become more like me, or more like us. God was using the royal we. Because they had become more like God, because they could no longer get a pass for being innocent. That's why they had to leave. They had to pack up and go. They couldn't live in the garden anymore because of what they knew. It was a power of discernment that they had about their actions that made it where they could no longer live in this state of being cared for, of being treated like children by God. We had to grow up. I also think that the consequences that God points out for Adam and Eve when they leave are very important. It's interesting. Adam was given one particular punishment, a thing that he had to do for the rest of his life, and all his descendants would have to do for the rest of their lives because of what happened. And Eve was given, well, really two punishments. For Adam, his punishment was that he could no longer just reach out and grab whatever fruit he wanted. He would have to work for his food for the rest of his life. Everything he ate would have to be wrested from the earth through the sweat of his brow. That nothing would come easy for him anymore. That wealth would have to be something that he fought and scrapped for. And the world would be full of the risk of famine, thanks to the knowledge they had. Which is kind of a leap, but when you think it through, you start to think, wow, this story has some strange and interesting and alarming things to say about human nature, because it's trying to say, guys, no, all of your problems come from this one mistake that they made, this one kind of decision that they made. And, well, it was actually Adam made one particular mistake, and Eve listened to the serpent and made the decision to go ahead and eat the fruit and convince Adam. Adam's crime was listening to Eve. Adam's moral responsibility at that point would have been, no, I'm not going to eat that. But Adam did eat it, and his punishment was being forced to work for his entire life. Eve's first punishment was pain and difficulty in childbirth. And so the difficulty that human women have when having children, which is famous in the animal kingdom, people in antiquity apparently noticed that. And they started to wonder, gosh, why is it that other organisms can reproduce with a lot less drama and risk than humans can? As I think I've mentioned before, there's a line from a play in Euripides written late 5th century BC in Athens. And in that play, he writes that he would rather fight 5 battles than have one child. And really, we're just looking at the odds there. Sure, ancient combat was very deadly, but so was ancient childbirth. They were both battlefields. And Eve's second punishment was how she was going to be treated by her husband. That she was going to be forced into a subordinate position because of the mistake that was made. So you can see that the Garden of Eden story has some similarities to the Prometheus story. In both cases, you have these lesser beings that, quote-unquote, stole a power that they were not supposed to have. In the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit that was stolen was a kind of knowledge, an ability to sense the difference between good and evil, moral responsibility. Now, the Promethean myth is a lot more material, a lot more direct. It was just stealing fire. But I think that the Greco-Roman world would have seen the connection. In other words, that discernment, that ability to recognize moral principles was every bit as dangerous and constructive, but also possibly destructive as fire. In fact, once an organism has fire or any other kind of dangerous technology, then their ability to discern good from evil becomes infinitely more important. As I've said before, when I talked about superhero stories, I've mentioned the idea that superhero stories are very good for analyzing moral conundrums and dealing with social issues and moral philosophy, because these are beings that have so much power that their individual actions matter so much that it's a great context for writers to force us to examine people's choices. And so, in general, both the Adam and Eve story and the Pandora's Box story and the Promethean story all have to do with humans beginning to understand that at some point in their past, in their collective past, they made a mistake. We made a mistake. And that mistake had something to do with taking on power and responsibility that we weren't ready to handle appropriately. And I think, by the way, that's why Prometheus has been attached to figures like Robert Oppenheimer. Famously, in the recent Christopher Nolan movie, Oppenheimer is painted as an American Prometheus, somebody who reached out and stole a kind of power that we weren't supposed to have, and took on a responsibility that we weren't ready for. Well, now that John has eaten the little scroll, he's being told that he's ready for more prophecies, apparently. Let's listen to what happens next. The angel is going to give John a job to do, and we're about to meet two new interesting characters. Our two special end times prophets who will emerge. And what do you know? They have special powers also. Let's see what happens next.
And I was given a long cane, like a measuring staff. And he was saying,
"Get up and measure God's temple. And the altar, and the people who worship there. But exclude the outer court of the temple. Do not measure it, because it has been given over to the nations of the earth. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. And I will send 2 of my witnesses to prophesy for 1,260 days while wearing sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wishes to harm them, fire comes out of their mouth. And devours their enemies. So, if anyone wishes to harm them, they must be killed in this way.
Wow. Okay. Well, these 2 guys are pretty interesting. And we're going to start with these guys at the start of the next volume. And we're going to take up the story of these 2 prophets as we begin our next volume. We're going to have to talk about a lot of things. We're going to have to talk about, what city is this? Why are we being so specific about the time intervals? Why is the city being handed over to the nations of the world? We'll also have to talk about how the word ethnos came to mean people outside of the Abrahamic tradition. We're talking about a Greek term that is used in a similar way to how we use the word Gentile, although that word comes from the Latin side of things through French, of course. In the next episode, we're going to find out that these beings can control the weather. And they don't use that power in a way that people like. And things are really starting to ratchet up. In the next volume, we're going to meet the woman who is standing on the moon. And this woman gives birth to a very special child. Then we're going to meet the gigantic fire-red 7-headed dragon that attempts to eat the child as soon as it's born. So what this means is that in the next volume, we're going to talk a lot about dragons. You wouldn't think that would be a huge subject when dealing with a book from the Bible, but apparently it is. We're going to talk about dragons and where they come from. Who came up with them? What are they supposed to be? How old are they? Where else are dragons talked about in the Bible? And I've got some dragon-related conspiracy theories to talk about. In fact, a fascination with dragons might literally be built into our DNA by natural selection. And more on that in the next volume, when we will also get closer to talking about the number 666. But just so you know, that won't be all the fun it's cracked up to be. Remember, it's math, after all. We're going to actually have to get into the Hebrew alphabet, and we're going to calculate the numbers of names using the same ancient gematria technique that John was familiar with. So it's fun. I mean, of course it's fun. How could it not be fun? It's learning the alphabet of another language and then doing a weird math game using that alphabet. I don't see how that could possibly not be a blast. We're going to see what my name adds up to. And you'll be able to figure out what your name will add up to. What number would John use as a code for you if he was trying to say you were the lead representative of Satan on Earth? What would your number be? The cool thing is, no matter how I do it, I always come up with number 1. I'm number one. And, there's nothing I can do about that. That's just math. We'll see if your name adds up to the number one also. I suspect that any avid listener to this podcast is going to be a number one. And we'll prove that next time. So until next time, talk to you later.